mistakes. The tips that follow are suitable for qualitative, quantitative and mixed methods projects, so there should hopefully be something for everyone. I'll be covering golden rules for data analysis, techniques for keeping track of it all, issues relating to data analysis software, and I'll finish off with some suggested resources if you need to learn more. And I have quite a few references at the end of my slides. So just a reminder, if you're having trouble finding the handout at all in the control panel, I have the website there that you can download the slides from. Now, as we go through today, as I hinted at before, we'd love to hear if you have any more general questions about data analysis. So you can send us questions either about anything I'm referring to on my slides, or if you have a more general question you'd like us to address, you can send those through at any point. We'll see how we go for time. I'll cover as many as I possibly can at the end of the webinar. And we would also love to know if you have any tips of your own. And we're going to run this, because we've got such a big group attending, we thought we'd run a little bit of a competition. So if you send Andrew through a data analysis tip, he will be picking the best one that's submitted, and as a prize you will get a $100 credit for use on any one of our services here at Academic Consulting. So I sometimes find a bit of competition motivates people. So any data analysis tips you've got of your own, you're welcome to send those through as we go through the content today. If you could just clearly mark that as a tip so it's not too confusing for us while we're dealing with questions as well. But let's get cracking with the content, beginning with some of my golden rules for working with and analysing data. Now, I'll warn you, a lot of these might seem like simple common sense, but I think when we get busy with our research and feel like we're drowning in data, common sense sometimes goes out the window, so I think it pays to be reminded. Now, my first tip is one I say a lot, and I suspect looking at the attendance list, a number of you have heard me say this before. Your research question underpins absolutely everything in your project. It's the central point of your research. Now, it becomes particularly important at the data analysis stage. Your research question needs to be guiding the analyses you choose to do, because ultimately the results of your analysis need to actually answer your research question in some way. As I just mentioned, I do a lot of individual work with researchers relating to their analysis. Often they come in to see me, they dump their laptop and a ton of data down on the desk and say, I'm completely overwhelmed. I have no idea where to even begin with my analysis. The very first thing I ask them is what their research question is, and they often look at me with an absolute horrified expression on their face. They realise they've been so busy collecting data, they've completely lost sight of the question that they set out to answer in the first place. Now, you are probably sitting there thinking, well, that's pretty obvious. Of course you're going to have your research question in mind. I've got to say, this is a mistake that I see even my more experienced colleagues make. So I want you to think for a moment. Can you, right off the top of your head, tell me exactly what the research question or questions are for your current research project without having to think too hard about it? Now, if not, your research question isn't top of mind as it should be. Now, out of interest, if you do know your research question off the top of your head, send it through to us via the control panel. It would be really interesting to see what topics you're all researching. So if you do know your research question just like that, send it through the control panel. Maybe also let us know what type of design you're using. Is it qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods? Now, while you're possibly typing that, or panicking because you can't remember, I'm going to give you my absolute favourite piece of advice for data analysis. Keep your research question in absolute plain sight while you're working. Even for me, even though I'm a more experienced researcher, I literally have it pinned up on the wall right in front of me, so it is constantly there as a reminder. Now, I'm very impressed, folks, by the number of people that have immediately sent through their research question. I think that will stand you in very good stead for the data analysis for your research. Now, my next tip relates to timing. Data analysis is quite time-consuming, and the worst thing you can do is rush it. So make sure you've allowed enough time in your project timeframes so that you can do the really good quality thinking and analytic work that you need to do at this stage of the process. Now, qualitative is admittedly much more time consuming than quant, but even a good quantitative analysis can take a bit of time. Now, the timeframes you'll need for a quantitative project vary hugely, so I'm not even going to try and give you time estimates for that. For a qualitative project based on interviews, just to give you a feel for the time involved, if you're doing 1 hour semi-structured interviews, you should really allow 5 to 6 hours per interview to transcribe it and 3 to 4 hours to analyse. So you're looking at 8 to 10 hours per interview, and that doesn't even include the time to write it up or collect the data in the first place. Now, those of you who are more experienced will be well familiar with the timeframes involved for qual, but I usually find that novice researchers are a little bit startled by the amount that it takes. Now, if you're brand new to the type of analysis you're conducting, maybe you've never done qual before, or it's a brand new type of quantitative analysis for you, or you're maybe new to the software you're using, then this rule of allowing more time than you think you need definitely applies. You need to allow enough time to make a few mistakes along the way. So my third tip, have a clear analysis plan, even if you don't end up sticking to it. I think sometimes when researchers are at the research design stage, they see analysis as this kind of vague thing that will happen at some point in the future. It's something you don't need to worry about till later. That's an extremely bad trap to fall into. You need to be thinking towards analysis at every stage of your research. Now, just to give you an example of that, at the data collection stage, if you don't collect the right amount of data or the right type of data, your analysis is going to be pretty difficult. So on a quantitative project, for example, certain types of statistical analyses require very large sample sizes. So you need to know that at the outset so that you can ensure you collect enough data in the first place. Likewise, if you don't think towards your analysis at the data entry and preparation stages, you might end up with data that's unanalysable. Now, I'm not entirely sure that's a word, but I'm sure you get the idea. So another example for you here, I come across a lot of SPSS users who run into difficulty because some of the variables have been entered as text rather than numerical values. Now that's absolutely fixable, but you may as well save yourself time by getting it right in the first place. Now, before I leave this point, I do want to say that while it's important to have an analysis plan, you also need to be flexible with it. As a general rule, research never goes the way you think it will. In fact, that's probably the one thing you can count on a research project. Things won't go to plan. So it might be that you need to adjust your plan slightly. On a quantitative project, for example, it might be that you don't manage to recruit enough people to run the analysis you want, or you might end up with non-normal data and need to change the type of tests you intend to run. So do have a clear plan in place before you collect the data, but be prepared to tweak it if you need to. Now, there will be a limit as to how much you can tweak that plan, of course. On a qualitative project, you have a lot more flexibility to change the research design and the analysis plan as you go through. On a quantitative project, if you change things, there still needs to be an appropriate level of structure around what you do. You can't just go on a fishing expedition. So something I see a lot in quantitative analysis is people just head out and run a bunch of statistical tests hoping for the best. Now, that's a really, really bad idea, because the more statistical tests you run, the more likely it is you'll get an error. So you need to have a very clear idea from the outset exactly what sort of questions you want answers to, so that you're not heading out and just making a massive fishing trip on your data. Now, I've been asked a really good question in relation to this. Di has asked how you actually make an analysis plan. Now, I think this is something that will develop with experience, and I've got a few comments to make depending on whether or not you're a student or a more experienced researcher. If you're a student, having a plan for your analysis should ideally be done with your supervisor or someone within your faculty or department that can specifically help with data analysis issues. So I think if you're a novice researcher, getting some help from within your organisation is the best idea. Even if you're more experienced, though, you might be tackling a brand new type of data analysis that you've never tackled before. So I think in that case, it's worth actually either chatting to an expert, so people like us here at Academic Consulting, or alternatively having a chat sitting down with a more experienced colleague who can help see ahead and see some of the pitfalls that you might encounter. I do think it's all very well and good reading about how to do data analysis from books, but nothing beats having actual experience, because that's going to help you formulate that analysis plan and move forward. So I hope those comments were helpful, Di. It's quite a tricky one to answer in a brief way, but that's my top of mind thoughts. Now, I can see from the research questions and designs that came through that we do have a few quant people in the group. So, classic mistake I see quantitative researchers make, they dive straight into statistical testing. As researchers, we are obsessed with p-values. All we want to know is whether or not we have a significant effect in our data. Jumping straight in can be to your disadvantage. You can miss patterns in the data that were unexpected, and you might not fully understand the stats test you're conducting because you're not familiar with the story that the data is telling. I always start my statistical analysis with some basic descriptive statistics, not just to assess normality and check for errors, which is something I'll come back to later, but also just to give me a feel for the data. That can help inform any analysis I do later down the track. Now, I know for some people they feel like that's delaying getting started, but it usually pays off tenfold later down the track. Now, for those of you that sent us a message to say you're undertaking a qualitative project, the opposite actually applies. Ideally, on a qualitative project, you want to start analysing your data right away. Now, you would never do that on a quant project. There's no point calculating things like means and standard deviations until you have all the data in. But on a qual project, you can actually start your analysis the minute you get that first piece of data. And I actually believe it's in your best interest to do that. Starting early with your analysis can inform later data collection you conduct, can allow you to change your design slightly if you need to. And I think the sooner you start your analysis, the sooner some of the insights can occur from that analysis. It seems slightly counterintuitive, but it's a really good habit to develop, getting started with that analysis immediately, but only on Qual. Now, with any analysis, it will always be a case of garbage in, garbage out. It doesn't matter how good your analysis skills are or how flash the software is you're using. If the data you're working with hasn't been carefully checked and prepared, any analysis you conduct on it will essentially be rubbish. Always stop and take the time to ensure your data is as clean and accurate as possible. Now, in terms of what that actually looks like in practice, for a quantitative data set, make sure you have cleaned and screened the data. Check for data entry errors, assess the normality of the data if that's something that's going to be important for your statistical tests. All those sorts of things, you just need to stop and check. If you begin straight away by running your significance tests and then you discover that there's some data missing or some values have been incorrectly entered, then you're actually going to need to do all of those tests all over again. So once again, it may feel like you're delaying starting, but taking that chance to clean and screen the data before you begin can pay off tenfold later down the track. Now, with qualitative, you might not be dealing with numbers, but any data still needs to be cleaned. So make sure any field notes are understandable. Check all your interview and focus group transcripts are accurate. Checking the accuracy of transcripts is going to be particularly important if you have outsourced your transcription. So regardless of whether or not it's a piece of software or a human being that's transcribed your recordings, it's really important that you as the researcher goes through and checks that the transcript is an accurate reflection of what was said. Now, lastly, in terms of this slide, it's probably worth checking that all your data is consistently entered and presented across each file. I'm going to be mentioning consistency a few times today. I really think consistency is the key to a successful piece of data analysis. Now, my last tip in this particular section, there's no such thing as bad results. Now, I want to qualify that point because results can be bad if they're based on inaccurate data or if you've done the analysis itself wrong. What I'm referring to here is that one of the things I often hear from researchers is that they're worried they won't get the results they're expecting or they won't get significance if it's a quant project. I actually think that's kind of exciting. Sometimes the most interesting stories come from something that didn't happen or wasn't mentioned, or a finding that didn't pan out. It's really important that you let your data tell the story. While that sounds easier said than done, and it is, it will save you an awful lot of work trying to rationalize a finding later or trying to make a result fit with your preconceived notion of the result. Now, don't get me wrong, it's really gutting when you don't find what you hoped. And this is something I have first-hand experience of. I didn't find what I expected to in my PhD research. I taught a group of students how to improve their study strategies. I spent ages developing an intervention program for them and teaching them and tracking their progress. And despite all of my hard work, my quantitative data showed that what I taught them made absolutely no difference whatsoever. It was pretty upsetting, as you can probably imagine. Now, I remember wasting ages trying to find a way to write up the data to minimize what I'd found. And in the end, once I came to terms with the fact that my intervention actually didn't make a difference, I was able to write up a really interesting chapter on why it didn't work. And the examiners commented that it was actually the best aspect of my entire PhD. So it just goes to show what you can do with unexpected findings. Well, that's my golden rules covered. Now, I can see a few other questions that have come in. I might just save questions for the end, just so that we know how much time we've got left. So if your question is currently unanswered, don't worry, we will deal with those at the end of the session. So I'll move into how to keep track of it all, which is probably one of the most challenging aspects of data analysis. Now, those of you who are more experienced might be surprised to see my next tip about unique identifiers. You would be surprised how many projects I see where the researcher has either failed to use unique identifiers at all, or they've been inconsistent with the use of them throughout their project. Now, if you're new to research, you might be wondering what a unique identifier is. It's a really simple concept. It's an identifier that you attach to the data for each participant, or maybe each case, within your study. The purpose of it is to help you keep track of all the data. So if perhaps someone asks their data to be withdrawn, or you notice a data entry error and you need to locate the raw data to double check it, you've got that unique identifier to use as an easy reference to track things down. Now, it's your choice as to what you might use. It might be a random number or a sequential one. You might use people's first names, keeping in mind, of course, that the names need to be unique. You could use pseudonyms, or you might have pre-existing identifiers. So things that spring to mind there would be student ID or hospital ID. Now, the key thing here is always decide up front on your project what convention you'll use. Keep it simple. Simple is really important here, and ensure it's consistently used throughout the project. For those of you attending that are doing mixed methods research, it's really important you make sure that your qualitative and quantitative identifiers actually match up. It's a really common mistake that researchers use numerical IDs in their quant, but then use actual names or pseudonyms in their qual, and that can make it really difficult to make comparisons and look for patterns later down the track, especially if you're using software or databases to match people up. Now, building on the idea of using unique identifiers, for those of you that are working on qualitative projects, I want to make specific comment about consistency in relation to pseudonyms. So something I'm seeing a lot of lately is research projects where the researcher keeps changing their mind about whether to use real names or pseudonyms for participants. I want to make the point that changing your mind partway through can be really time consuming and can also lead to unnecessary errors. So as I've just said on the previous slide, make a decision up front and stick to it. Now, I'm very aware that you won't be able to use real names in the actual write-up, but you could use them right up until that point and then switch to an anonymous identifier at that writing stage. That's personally how I approach it. I find it easier to use people's actual names for the data analysis because that's what I can relate to. Then I switch to something that won't identify individuals at the write-up stage. Now, the tip on this slide, though, isn't just about identifiers. Inconsistent labelling is a researcher's nightmare. Now, you might be wondering what on earth you might label in research. I'm thinking about things like file names. In quant research, it might be your variable names or category labels. And we've just talked about unique identifiers. They're a form of labeling. Have a really good system in place for the conventions you'll use. Remember to keep things simple, but also descriptive so that they're useful for you. So to give you an example of what I mean, on a qualitative project where you're working with interview transcripts, use the same convention to name all of your transcripts. Include the unique identifier, maybe a brief code to indicate some basic demographics, and you could possibly include a date to indicate when the interview was conducted, and use that system across every single file so they're all labelled the same way. Now that's just an example of what you could include. It will obviously depend on your project as to what will be most useful. Now, if you haven't been consistent with the labeling of your files, and then you've also got multiple copies of each file, it is going to get seriously confusing. I'm a huge fan of keeping things simple on research. I think research is hard enough as it is without making it unnecessarily complicated. Keep that in mind when you think about how many data files you really need. Very common scenario I see are researchers who have endless backups of their files. Or another one is multiple files with the suffix of final on them. I'm pretty sure you know what I mean because I suspect a number of you do it yourself. So SPSS data final, SPSS data final final, SPSS data really is the final one this time. It's that kind of thing. Now, I'm not going to get into a lecture here on making backups and managing multiple versions. You need to work out a system that will suit you and will suit your IT setup as well. But I have to question how many versions of a data file you really need. I do keep multiple versions, but the ones that aren't active I keep in a folder marked archive so that I don't get confused as to what the most up-to-date version is. Something I see often when working individually with researchers sometimes takes them 10 minutes to find the most up-to-date version of their file. Well, how helpful is that? If you have to do that every time, that's a lot of 10-minute chunks of time that you could actually be spending on your analysis. Now, if you're sitting there either smiling or cringing because you know that you are guilty of this, just a little bit of a tip from someone that has been there and knows what it's like. Can be a little bit overwhelming to get yourself organised because if you've got lots of files all over the place, it might seem quite daunting to get started. So if I find my files are getting out of hand, I put 10 minutes aside every day and I just spend that trying to get things organised, and I get as far as I can and just do another 10-minute chunk the next day. And I like to do that at the end of the day when I'm a bit tired and can't do anything overly productive. So there's a challenge for you. If you are sitting there and you're thinking, gosh, I'm really guilty of having files all over the place, set yourself a challenge for the next 2 weeks. You'll spend 10 minutes a day sorting out that filing system. If you think you might be doing that, send us a message to let us know. Now, on a related note, I'm always amazed by how many researchers make endless backups of their writing and then totally fail to back up their transcripts, their Excel spreadsheets, SPSS data files, and in vivo projects. Now, as I've said, I'm not going to get into talking about what the best method for backing up is. You'll all have different IT setups. If you're not confident that you're doing a good job of this, make a point that straight after this webinar, you're going to go and talk to someone who's IT savvy so that you can sort that out. Now, I have a theory that age has made me a better researcher. Not because I'm more experienced, but because my memory is getting worse, so I always make a point of writing things down. The rule of thumb for any research project is don't assume you'll remember, because you won't. Record everything, particular tasks you've completed, decisions you've made and why, next steps, challenges you've encountered, etc. I think that's particularly important on a qualitative project where a lot of somewhat subjective decisions might be being made, but it's important on a quant project too. Now, it doesn't matter where you keep the records, as long as you have some sort of system in place. It might be a memo in an in vivo project, an ongoing note in an Evernote account, or you might be a bit more old school and prefer a hard copy research journal that you record things in. All of those options are fine. It's about finding a system that works for you. Now, a system that won't work is scribbling things on post-its and endless notes on your desk that end up getting lost and you can't find them easily later. So that's not a system. Have a think about having some sort of central system. As I've just mentioned, it might be something in Evernote or a research journal, but also think about some of the more sort of one-off things that you might need to record and where you might put that. There's a few things spring to mind here, once again using both NVivo and SPSS as examples. On a NVivo project, one thing you can do is record descriptions or definitions for all of your codes or nodes, and that can be stored inside NVivo so that you don't lose them on scribbled bits of paper. You always know where to go to if you need to refer back to something. Likewise, NVivo has something called annotations, and it also has, as I've just hinted at, a memos feature where you can keep a log of your analysis, but also the more sort of one-off things that might be relevant to your project. For those of you that might be using SPSS, something that a lot of people are unaware of, there is a little notes field in the output viewer. It is hidden, but if you have a look down the left-hand side, you will see it there. And I quite like recording information in that notes field, perhaps why I chose a particular statistical test, and maybe some reflections on the early results that I'm seeing. Now, in all of those examples that I've just given, the beauty of that is it's attached to my data and my analysis. So I don't need to worry about losing it. I've got a central place that it's stored in. Now, keeping records like that might seem really tedious. I can guarantee it will totally pay off when you're at the writing up stage. Now, my last point in this section is a relatively obvious one, ensuring all data and analysis is secure and confidential. That is your responsibility as a researcher. If you're storing information on the servers your organisation provides, it should hopefully be pretty secure. But what about other places you store information? Dropbox, Google Drive, the USB pen kicking around at the bottom of your bag that could potentially fall out and find its way into enemy hands, so to speak. If you aren't 100% sure about the location you're storing your data, keep in mind that most applications provide options to password protect files. So if you do have files on a USB pen, you're worried about losing it, most electronic files can be password protected. So SPSS data files, Excel spreadsheets, Microsoft Word transcripts, NVivo projects, all of them have a capacity in the software to add a password to your file. And if you're using something that doesn't offer that as an option, you can compress the data in a folder and put a password on the folder. So in other words, there is absolutely no excuse not to ensure your data is safe and secure. Now, I've started talking a little bit about software, so let's get into that in a little bit more detail. Now, I'm about to talk about the advantages of using software, but I think it's important to keep in mind software isn't suitable for all projects. So if you have a very small qualitative project, for example, it might not be worth the time investment to learn something like NVivo. Highlighter pens and post-it notes might do the trick, or you could use non-specialist software. And I'm thinking there, Microsoft Word and Excel both actually do a surprisingly good job of analysing small qualitative data sets. Just a note about that though, if you're considering not using software such as NVivo or SPSS because you've heard from others that it's difficult to use and hard to learn, have a chat to other researchers who do use it. There are a lot of misconceptions out there about the use of data analysis software, so don't believe the first person that tells you not to use it. Seek a second opinion. Now, if you do make a decision to use it, remember it's not a magic wand. It won't magically analyse the data for you. If you're using statistical software, you still need to understand which test is appropriate and also understand exactly what questions it is that you're asking. You'll also need to understand what the results mean. If you're using qualitative software, well, it's not going to come up with the ideas for the codes and themes for you. You need to tell the software what they are and mark up the text appropriately with them. Likewise, something like NVivo won't transcribe recordings or produce a report for you to include in your write-up. Now, the implication of all of this is that you really need to know your stuff. You can't avoid learning about statistics or the possible different approaches to qualitative data analysis just because you're using a piece of software. And if you don't learn how to approach the particular data analysis tasks that you're engaged with, then using the software will be like going out on the road without knowing the road code. You are going to land yourself in all sorts of trouble. Now, in terms of options, I could probably have spent the whole hour-long webinar just discussing the various software options that are out there. We're very much spoilt for choice these days. Common qualitative options are NVivo, MaxQDA, Deduce, and Atlas TI, while popular quantitative options are SPSS, SAS, Minitab, and R. Now, they're just a few of the possibilities. When you're making a decision about what software to use, you need to be sure that the software of your choice will suit both your data and research question, and that you have access to it through your organisation. These types of applications can be really expensive to buy. You also want to check that it's going to be reasonably easy to learn, either because the software is user-friendly or because you have access to training courses and other resources. Also, don't forget that, as I've just mentioned, it could be that Word or Excel will suit your purposes for a qualitative project. And for quant, not only does Excel do a pretty good job of basic descriptive stats, in my opinion, I think it actually does a much better job of graphs. I wouldn't use Excel for statistical testing, but I think for data entry and charts and basic descriptive stats, it's absolutely fine. Something else to keep in mind with software, I'm often asked about free options, given how pricey some of these can be. I think there are some good free options on the market, but I would also make a bit of a caveat there that you pay for what you get, and it can be a little bit harder to get support for something that's not more commonly used. Now, if you need a recommendation, here at Academic Consulting, NVivo and SPSS is our software of choice. And a little bit later in the slides, I have a couple of websites you can go to if you're interested in learning more about the various options. Now, one of the great things about software is that it can speed up repetitive or administrative tasks for you. So as I've said, it won't do the analysis, but why waste time doing more manual tasks if the software will do the work for you? To give you a couple examples, NVivo has an auto-coding function that will enable you to automatically group together everything a particular person said or every response for a specific question. Likewise, SPSS has something called syntax, which is the programming language it uses. So if you run the same set of procedures regularly, you can save the syntax for them, and each time you run them, all you need to do is actually click a button rather than choosing all the menu options. Now, they're just a few examples of automation and data analysis software. It's definitely worth finding out what options there are for the application that you're using. Now, time and time again, I hear researchers say that software such as NVivo is a waste of time, won't allow them to analyse their data the way they want it. Now, I'm sure there are some things that you might want your software to do that it doesn't, but as a general rule, Data analysis software will perform most tasks that you need. So if it can't do something, it might be that you actually just don't know how. And I'm going to talk more about some options for learning in that situation. The other thing I often see is researchers using data analysis software in a very time-consuming, convoluted manner. If something seems to be taking you longer than you expect, just stop for a minute. Have a think whether or not there might be a better way to perform the task. Do a quick Google search, talk to a colleague, or contact us here at Academic Consulting to find out if there's a better way to achieve it. Now, I realise that software is becoming increasingly user-friendly, but data analysis software can be quite complex if you want to use it well. So rather than jumping straight in, take the time to learn how to use your software effectively. As I've just mentioned, there are probably all sorts of time-saving tricks that you might not be aware of. With software, it's often a case of you don't know what you don't know. Another issue can be that if you don't learn how to use software well, you can actually make your analysis unnecessarily complicated, and that can cost you significant time, which is less than ideal. And of course, if you need to learn about data analysis software, we have lots of courses here at Academic Consulting that will help you save time. So on that note, I've thrown quite a lot of information and tips at you. I'd like to just finish off by talking about some possible resources and also some courses. Now, we've had a number of tips come through, and I will be getting Andrew very shortly to let me know who the winner is. Just a quick reminder about that. If you have a tip of your own and you want to enter it into the competition, now's your chance to send that through to Andrew. We'll be letting you know who the winner is at the end of the webinar. And thanks to those of you that have sent your tips through already. I can actually see a few of them on screen now, and they look fabulous. So if you have heard me talk about these tips for the last 50 minutes and you're thinking, gosh, I actually need to brush up on my skills, I have some resources for you. The first couple relate to some options for you for both quantitative and qualitative data analysis. So there's actually a really good list on Wikipedia of the different stats packages, and the other website I've got there is the Cactus Networking Project, and with that, that's basically reviews of all of the qualitative software that's out there, and it's all objective, which I really like. So that's worth a look if you're wanting to know what your options are for qual. Also, just a reminder that we have lots of blog posts on our website that have a lot of data analysis tips in them. And if you're on a qual project, the online QDA website is a really nice place to look for more data analysis tips. And also, just for those that might have joined us a little bit late today, the slides for today you can download from this particular link here. Now, in terms of textbooks, these are my three favourite texts for quant. The Morgan book technically isn't data analysis, but it helps you understand the tables that are produced and also helps you write it up. I'm going through these slides quite quickly, folks. They were provided more as a reference. I wasn't necessarily planning to talk about each one. I've got my four favourite books for qualitative data analysis, and also got three mixed methods books that I really rate. The Cresswell and Tedley books are more generally about mixed methods, but they both have an excellent data analysis chapter. Now, I obviously have heaps of recommendations, but I've limited those three slides to just my absolute favourites in terms of good textbooks. And in terms of training courses that you can do here at Academic Consulting, I've just listed all of our upcoming data analysis software courses. Just a note, if you're an SPSS user, the next SPSS course is actually next week, SPSS Made Easy, and that one still does have some places available. And if you're interested in any of those others, there are dates on our website. But we also teach skills as well, and there are a couple in particular that are relevant to today's course. Our analysing qualitative data and writing up qualitative data are both packed full of tips, just like the ones I've covered today, and they are coming up on the 1st of June and the 8th of June. So you've got a week or so to register for those if you'd like, and we've also got some more advanced courses and a stats course as well. And if you would like some individual help, just a wee reminder in case you haven't heard the news, we have just launched a number of thesis boot camps. Now, these are a way of you getting some individual advice about your project, and I can see some of the questions that were coming through today are around what's in an analysis plan, how do I make one, how do I know which approach to use for my data analysis, and they're all things that I can cover as part of our thesis boot camps. Now, the idea here for the boot camps, it's not a course per se, so you don't need to attend at a set date and time. So it runs for a 3-month period. You get access to recordings of a bunch of webinars like the one I've done today, and you can watch them at your convenience. You get a goal setting worksheet that will help you plan for the next 3 months. And I guess more importantly, in the context of this webinar, you get 4 hours individual time with me. And if you need help with data analysis, you can just spend that 4 hours chatting to me and having me give you a bit of a guiding hand there. If you're not a student, you can still book these types of things with me. We've just put individual assistance together in a more structured way. So the next one that runs is next Monday, but we also have some later dates as well. But I wanted to finish off with some of the questions that came through, and we'll also let you know who the winner of the tip was. So I'm just scrolling through. Bear with me for a moment while I find which questions need answered still. And if you have any unanswered questions of your own, you're welcome to send those through. So looks like Adele has asked what an analysis plan includes. It's a really good question, Adele. It's quite a hard one to answer simply because it's going to depend on whether it's a quant or a qual project and what the specific approach within that is. To give you a few examples, on a quant project, it might be the nature of the variables you're going to be collecting data on and what specific tests you'll be running on those and why. On a qual project, it would probably be more to do with the particular coding approach that you'll take, how you'll come up with the ideas for your codes, how you'll develop themes from those codes later, and so on. So a little bit tricky to answer. I hope that gives you some ideas. Of course, you can enroll in one of our thesis boot camps if you need to develop one yourself. Ida's asked a question that we haven't answered yet, which is, when we analyse qualitative data, what are other things that can be used to guide us beside our research question? I think having a really clear code book would be the first thing I'd say there. So having a code book which involves a list of all your codes and definitions, having that sitting by you can really help inform your analysis process. Keeping in mind, of course, that that may need to be flexible. It's also your record of how your analysis is developing over time. Once again, that's quite a complex question to answer concisely, but that would be one thing that springs to mind. And the other would be, if it's a interview or focus group project, the other thing that would guide your analysis would, of course, be the actual interview questions that you've asked. I'm just scrolling down to see if there's anything else. Great question from Amanda. Do you think it's a good idea to use software to transcribe and review it? Will it save time? So I'm guessing what you mean there, Amanda, is perhaps processing your recording through some sort of speech-to-text software, or I know a lot of people are uploading their recordings to YouTube and having that generate captions and building a transcript from that. Just a note, if you are using the YouTube option, I'd have some serious concerns about data security and confidentiality. Or it might be you're using something like Dragon Naturally Speaking to process the files. So Amanda's question is, will it save time if you get something quickly processed by software and then you fix it up later? I think that will depend a lot on the person, but I know for me personally, Amanda, I prefer not to do that. I find that I'm actually quicker just typing it from scratch. Transcription is something we've done a lot over the years here at Academic Consulting, and we generally find if something has been badly done by another person or badly done by software, it is significantly longer to tidy it up. So if you're doing something for rough processing and then fixing it, I don't think that's a good idea. But I would like to say that is just my personal opinion, and I know a number of people who do like to do their transcription that way. Great question. Okay. Well, I've had a message through from Andrew. Just give me a moment to check over about the winner. Okay, so Andrew's message says we've had some great tips and it was actually really hard for him to choose a winner today, but unfortunately we need to choose one. So the winning tip regards keeping track of your data, and in particular keeping track of your analysis, which will not only help you as you go through your research, but is also great information to review prior to a PhD examination, just in case you get asked questions about how you did certain things within your research. I think that's a really lovely point, and that's from Amrit by the looks of it. So I talked about the importance of keeping records and keeping track of data and analysis decisions, but I didn't highlight that that can be particularly important to have a record of just before the examination process. So great, that's fabulous, Amrit. We will be in touch with how you can use your $100 credit. I have had a request as well about whether or not you guys can hear other people's tips. I'll just read out a couple quickly in the few minutes we've got left. So we've had a tip through from Di about sharing your data analysis process with others. She finds she gains inspiration when she shares ideas with fellow PhD students and academic friends. I think that's a lovely idea. She goes on to say, even if you share it with your husband or mother who has no idea about your research at all, it's still a good idea to share. When you speak out, you construct your new ideas. I couldn't agree more, and I must say, when I was doing my PhD, my cat knew an awful lot about my PhD topic and my data analysis. I did find just talking out loud really, really helped my thinking. There's also a lovely tip from Jade about creating an environment which is conducive to creative thinking if you're doing a qualitative study. So she goes on to say she lights a candle and has a nice warm snuggly place with snacks and gets rid of all distractions. I really like that one. That's fabulous. And one from Ida as well, do the data analysis while you're feeling fresh, preferably in a quiet place. So there's a common theme there. I'm analysing the data as I go. And also date, save and store the analysis in terms of having lots of good backups. So that's an awesome tip also. Now I think they're the ones that are immediately in front of me in terms of tips. Thanks for sharing those tips, everyone. We've had a lovely engaged group with lots of messages coming through and lots of tips and questions, which I've really appreciated. Just a final chance to send through any questions that you have while I wind up the session. And I would like to just finish up. It might be this is your first time coming across us here at Academic Consulting. So if you're not familiar with us, we're an Auckland-based company that provide research and training services. So I often joke that we can either teach you how to do the research yourself, or if you don't have time or resources, you can ask us to do the work for you. So what that means in practical terms, for those of you attending who are students, we can help you out with data analysis advice, as I've mentioned, teach you some software skills, and if you have a thesis to write, we have what I call our one-stop shop, which means we do the proofing, formatting, and reference checking. You still need to do the writing, I'm afraid, but we can assist with those other aspects. If you're an academic or in a more corporate setting, we can either provide advice for your project to help you get the work completed more efficiently, or you can outsource as much of your project as you'd like to us. So everything from data collection through to writing up the findings. And if you're interested in any of those services, I've got our website on screen now. Now, I think I have managed to get through all of the questions. There are a couple that have contacted me with more individual questions that I'll address back now offline. But otherwise, I'd just like to finish off by wishing you all the best for your data analysis. I really hope these tips today will help you out with it. Hope the data analysis goes well and you get some really incredible results, even if it's not what you expected. And don't hesitate to get in touch with us if we can be of any assistance here at Academic Consulting.